You just sat across from a financial advisor. They smiled, they nodded, they handed you a folder of recommendations, and some part of you is sitting here right now because you're wondering what wasn't in that folder. Here's the belief most people walk in with. My advisor is legally required to act in my best interest. That's what the word advisor implies. That's what it sounds like it means. It's not always true. And for someone starting late, in your 40s or 50s, playing catch-up, that gap can cost more than it costs almost anyone else because you don't have 30 years left to recover from a bad recommendation. Some advisors operate under something called a fiduciary standard, legally bound at all times to put your interests ahead of their own. Others operate under a lower bar called suitability. The product they recommend just has to be reasonably appropriate for you, even if a cheaper, better option existed on the same shelf. Nobody announces which one you're sitting across from. You have to ask directly, and most people never do. And that difference shows up in real numbers, not just legal language. A 1% annual fee doesn't sound dangerous, it sounds small. But on a portfolio growing over 25 years, that 1%, compounding against you every single year instead of for you, can quietly remove well over a quarter of what you would have ended up with. Not because anyone stole anything, because fees compound exactly like returns do, just working in the opposite direction, silently, in the background, for decades. Over this series, you've met 4 people. Sarah, rebuilding at 40 after a major life transition. Marcus, self-employed with income that swings every single month. David, who found out the IRS lets him contribute more once he turns 50. Linda, 10 years out with a real number she needs to hit. Every one of them, at some point, is going to sit across a desk from someone whose paycheck depends, at least partly, on what they recommend. This video is what that person is statistically less likely to bring up first, and why it happens that way. If you're already thinking, my advisor would never do that to me, I'm not saying yours is dishonest. Most advisors genuinely aren't. I'm saying the incentive structure exists whether any individual person leans on it or not, and you deserve to know exactly where it sits before you sit down across that desk again. Point 1. Certain products pay the person selling them dramatically more than others do, and that difference is rarely printed anywhere you'd casually see it. A variable annuity can carry a commission in the range of 5 to 7% of everything you put in, paid to the advisor up front the day you sign. Whole life insurance sold as a retirement vehicle can carry commissions in a similar range. Compare that to a simple index fund, which might pay the person recommending it nothing extra at all. That gap doesn't automatically make either product wrong for you. It's proof that the recommendation and the incentive aren't always pointing the same direction. And for a late starter with limited catch-up time, a 5 to 7% hit off the top, before your money has even started working, is money that never gets the chance to compound. Marcus almost bought a variable annuity in his second year of self-employment. It was pitched as guaranteed income, no more market stress, exactly the kind of certainty that sounds appealing when your paycheck already swings from month to month. What wasn't emphasized nearly as clearly, the layered annual fees on that product, stacked together, ran close to 3% a year, every year, for as long as he held it. On top of income that already had no floor, locking a chunk of it into a product with fees like that, instead of a low-cost brokerage account he could actually access, would have cost him flexibility exactly when he needed it most. Point 2. Actively managed mutual funds are still sold hard to late starters, often with a pitch about beating the market, which sounds appealing when you already feel behind and want to catch up faster than the math technically allows. But long-running, widely cited industry performance studies have consistently shown that roughly 85 to 90% of actively managed U.S. stock funds underperform a simple low-cost index fund over a 15-year stretch, after fees are accounted for. Not because the fund managers running them are bad at their jobs, because fees, trading costs, and taxes from constant buying and selling eat away at whatever edge they're trying to create. The boring alternative, a total U.S. stock index fund, a total international index fund, and a bond fund held together in one simple mix, has quietly outperformed most of what gets actively sold for a fraction of the annual cost. It's not exciting. It doesn't fill a folder with recommendations. It doesn't require a meeting every quarter to justify its existence. And that might be exactly part of why it isn't always the first thing pitched to someone who's nervous about starting late. Point 3. You've probably heard some version of, "You need $2 million to retire." That number gets repeated constantly, sometimes to be genuinely helpful, and sometimes because a bigger, scarier number makes a bigger managed account feel more urgent to build, faster, with more of your money under someone else's fee. The real number depends entirely on what you actually plan to spend every year, what guaranteed income you'll have from Social Security or a pension, and how long your money realistically needs to last. For some people, it genuinely is $2 million. For others, it's closer to $600,000. A single generic number applied to every late starter isn't a fact. It's a sales tool wearing the costume of a fact. Sarah ran into a version of this directly. Early in her rebuild, one advisor's opening pitch centered on a number nearly 3 times what her own later calculations showed she'd actually need, based on her real spending and her expected Social Security income. The bigger number wasn't dishonest exactly. It was just built for urgency, not for her specific life. And if you're sitting there thinking, okay, but how do I actually know my number? That's a completely fair question, and it's not something one video can answer for you personally. It's math based on your own spending, which is exactly why a real advisor conversation should start with your numbers, not with a template pulled off a shelf. Point 4 ties directly back to David's video. Catch-up contributions. The extra amount the IRS lets you add to a 401k or an IRA once you turn 50 don't generate a bigger fee for the advisor managing your account. They simply let you keep more of your own money working for you, faster, completely for free. It's genuinely useful, completely legal, zero-cost information. It also doesn't come up automatically in every single meeting because there's no product attached to it and nothing to sell. Nobody's incentive is to bring it up unless you specifically ask. Point 5. The rise of robo-advisors and low-cost do-it-yourself brokerage platforms exists specifically because traditional assets under management fees, often around 1% of your entire portfolio every single year for the rest of your life, got expensive enough that cheaper alternatives became an entire real business, almost overnight. A robo-advisor charging around 0.25% is doing a version of the same core job. Diversified investing, occasional rebalancing, some basic tax efficiency for a fraction of the annual cost. For someone catching up with less time left to recover lost growth, that gap compounds every bit as hard as the 1% number from earlier in this video. A platform like Betterment, for example, is built specifically around that lower fee, diversified, mostly hands-off structure. Useful context to have simply so you know that option exists before anyone across a desk implies it doesn't. Point 6, and this one's almost never brought up first in any meeting, delaying Social Security. For every year you wait past your full retirement age, up to age 70, your monthly benefit permanently increases, typically around 8% per year, guaranteed. That's a guaranteed increase, backed by the federal government, larger than almost any safe investment return available anywhere else on the market. For someone like Linda, with a 10-year runway before she needs the income, that single delay decision can matter more than almost anything her portfolio does. And it costs an advisor absolutely nothing to mention, which might be exactly why it sometimes doesn't come up unless you ask directly. Point 7. Target date funds get sold as the simple, set-it-and-forget-it answer for someone who feels behind and just wants the whole problem handled. They can genuinely be a reasonable option for a lot of people. What's less often explained clearly in the meeting, their underlying expense ratio, their specific mix of stocks and bonds at your exact age, and whether that mix is actually more conservative than someone with a longer working runway needs. All of that varies significantly from one fund company to the next. Simple got sold to you as a feature. It's still worth 10 minutes of actually checking what's inside the one you own. Point 8, and this one hides in plain sight, a static plan that never gets revisited. Sarah's original plan, built right after her transition, assumed an income level and a timeline that changed within 18 months. The plan itself wasn't reviewed again until she asked for the review herself. A commission-based product doesn't need updating to keep paying out. A percentage of assets fee doesn't need updating to keep getting collected. The incentive to actively revisit your plan as your real life changes underneath it is weaker than most people assume, which means that job quietly becomes yours, whether anyone tells you that upfront or not. Point 9. Even when a fund's advertised expense ratio looks low and reasonable, that's rarely the entire cost. Some funds carry an additional marketing fee, often called a 12B1 fee, quietly folded into that same headline number instead of broken out separately. Funds that trade frequently inside themselves also rack up transaction costs and bid-ask spreads that never show up as a single clean line item anywhere you'd normally look. None of this is illegal or hidden in any legally meaningful sense. It's disclosed, technically, in a document almost nobody actually reads in full. But technically disclosed and clearly explained across the table are two very different things, and only one of them tends to happen in a typical first meeting. There's also a psychological piece to all of this worth naming directly because it's aimed specifically at people who feel behind. Feeling behind creates urgency, and urgency is genuinely useful for making a real decision, but it's also exactly the emotional state that makes a bigger, more complex, higher-fee product feel like the responsible choice instead of the expensive one. "You're already behind, so you can't afford to be too conservative," is a sentence that can be completely true and still function as a very effective sales line in the same breath. Worth noticing when you hear it, and worth pausing on before you respond to it in the moment. None of this means walk away from every advisor you ever meet. A good one, working under a genuine fiduciary standard, charging a transparent, easy-to-understand fee, can be worth every dollar of it, especially once your situation gets more complex than a spreadsheet can comfortably handle alone. This isn't don't trust anyone. It's know exactly which questions get you an honest answer and ask them before you sign anything. So here's what that actually sounds like, in the room, out loud. Ask directly, are you a fiduciary at all times, for every one of my accounts, or only some of them? Ask, how exactly do you get paid? A flat fee, an hourly rate, a percentage of my assets, or a commission on what I buy? Ask, what would you recommend to me if you earned the exact same amount no matter which product I chose? That last question, more than any other, tends to surface the honest answer the fastest, because it removes the incentive from the room entirely, at least for the length of that one answer. One more worth asking, especially if you're over 50. Have we specifically talked about catch-up contributions, delaying Social Security, and the exact fees on everything you're recommending in plain numbers I could repeat back to a friend? If the answer to that one is vague, that's information too. Sarah, Marcus, David, and Linda are all in different spots. Different ages, different incomes, different amounts of runway left before they need this money. But every one of them gets stronger in exactly the same way, by understanding where the incentives actually sit before they hand a decision over to someone else, a decision that then has to compound quietly for the next 10, 20, 30 years, whether they're paying attention to it or not. That 1% from the start of this video isn't abstract anymore. It's the difference between a plan built around what genuinely serves you and a plan built around what pays the person recommending it. You don't need to distrust everyone you ever meet with a title like advisor. You need 3 plain language questions that make the incentive visible before you sign and the willingness to actually ask them out loud. That's the last video in this first arc. 10 videos, 4 people, one very unoriginal truth underneath all of it. Starting late isn't the problem most people think it is. Not asking the right questions at the right moment is. If this series has helped you at all, the next real step for a lot of you is doing the actual math on your own specific number, not a generic one handed to you across a desk. That's exactly what this channel is building toward next, a way to run your own numbers, your own timeline, your own real fees instead of relying on a folder somebody else assembled for you. Subscribe so you don't miss it and so you see it the moment it's ready. A quick note before you go. This video is for educational purposes only and isn't personalized financial advice. Talk with a licensed fiduciary advisor about your own specific situation before making any decisions.